Welcome to our fourth session of Racial Justice through Reimagining Policing. This special event is offered by the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice and is the fourth in a series of special forums discussing reimagining policing and how we can create meaningful change here in Delaware. Tonight, we will have a discussion between our expert on policing, Dr. James Nolan, and four professionals and advocates for individuals who have had interactions with police. These professionals will give us their perspectives on policing and their thoughts on how policing can be reimagined. I am Clara Licata, co-chair of the Legislative Advocacy Committee of the Alliance and an attorney admitted in New Jersey. Tom Irvin is the other chair, and he also is an attorney admitted in Arizona. We will be moderating this event and will monitor the chat. This special forum will last for 1 hour and 30 minutes. And to our audience members, you can pose questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. And if you'd like, before we begin, go ahead and put your name and a message to our moderators and panelists, and feel free to add where you are. Feel free to add where you are, whether you are here in Delaware or another state, or if you're part of an agency or organization. We are so excited to have you here tonight. In our first three sessions, we heard from Attorney General Kathy Jennings, state legislators, leaders of community groups, impacted members of the public, and law enforcement professionals. Now I would like to introduce our panelists for tonight. Dr. James Nolan, chair of the Sociology Department at West Virginia University, and the author of a number of books and articles on the topic of what real effective change in policing can look like. Misty Seaman, Assistant Public Director, Delaware Public Director, Assistant Public Defender, Delaware Public Defender's Office. Hanif Salan, Director, Campaign for Smart Justice, Delaware ACLU. Lynn Keelhorn, Citizen Advocate and active participant in the Coalition for Smart Justice, with leadership roles in the Campaign to End Debtors Prison, the Peace and Justice Work Group of Westminster Presbyterian Church, and the Delaware Poor People's Campaign. Larry Woolcan of the firms Willinger and Woolcan in Phoenix, Arizona, a civil rights lawyer with extensive experience in police detention cases. All of our Delaware panelists have served on subcommittees of the Delaware Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jim to introduce the subject. Jim, are you on? You're on mute.
Okay, I'm here now. Thank you, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for coming to this special forum. This is the fourth in a series of special forums about racial justice through reimagining the police. I don't want to repeat much of the material from previous sessions, but I want to highlight just a couple of main points in order to put our discussion tonight in a particular context. Following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the civil unrest that followed in many cities, including Wilmington, Delaware established the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force. And as you heard, most of the panelists tonight participated on subcommittees of the task force. During task force meetings, we noticed two important things. The first thing is that the police profession was being discussed as a law enforcement profession. Now, this is a linguistic trap that confuses a single public safety strategy, law enforcement, for the police profession itself. Now, this may seem like a small thing, but it has huge implications, which I'll explain in a few minutes. We also noticed that the problems in policing were being explained as the result of bad apple cops. So even the mantra from police circles during this time was, no one hates a bad cop more than a good cop. This kind of wrong thinking conceals the systemic nature of problems and makes punishing offenders seem like the most expedient way to solve problems of excessive force and discrimination. This is simply not the case, and why reforms have been so ineffective. So I want to show you just a couple of slides to make this idea more apparent and why transparency and accountability become so important. You know, earlier I've referred to policing as a game being played on a social field, like football. This is a sociological approach to understanding behavior. The logic of behavior on a football field originates in the field, not the players. The field produces a mindset in players which is reinforced by a reward structure. Here we have a helmet awards for good hits and touchdowns and interceptions. These are the things that everyone's trying to do. In the same way, the police are socialized in a paramilitary academy where the law enforcement approach is first taught. Officers internalize the game on the field, creating a mindset that keeps officers hypervigilant, looking for criminals, checking databases, finding reasons to stop cars or look inside for signs of criminal behavior, making arrests. The rewards are almost exclusively for making good arrests and seizing lots of illegal guns and drugs. The problem is building trust, solving problems, building relationships, making communities safer has very little to do with the law enforcement game. In the current law enforcement game, transparency and accountability are topic tonight. Only questions whether police officers follow policy and the law, i.e. whether they're in the right in using force, not whether force could have been avoided in the interest of community building and making places safer. A reimagined police might look something like this, where the police are socialized to learn a full range of strategies for making communities safer. The police mindset is to help communities fix problems, support each other, build networks of resources, ultimately make communities safer. Rewards and recognition should come from community outcomes rather than police outputs. A few summary points. Racial discrimination in Delaware policing is structured, it's systemic. It's not the result of bad apple deviance, but good apple conformity to rules and policies and harmful behaviors that discriminate. The logic that drives the behavior and the mindset of officers is the law enforcement game. Rewards and recognition for good police behavior is solely based on law enforcement outputs rather than community outcomes. Law enforcement is to policing as nail hammering is to the profession of carpentry. Carpenters are not rewarded for the number of nails they hammer, but what they build. The police too should build something, build trust, cohesion, dense networks of support and safety. The law enforcement approach is ineffective and a source of discrimination and prejudice. It creates conditions in local places for crime and violence to thrive. Finally, transparency and accountability in policing create conditions for community safety. It unifies the police and the public and prepares for transformation to a new game that involves the police and the community working together to make places safer and stronger. So I'm hoping our discussion tonight emphasizes the importance of transparency and accountability in policing from a variety of very interesting perspectives. So with that, I'll turn it back to Clara.
Thank you, Jim. As Jim said, tonight's focus is primarily going to be on transparency and accountability and how that affects relationships between the public and the police. Now, Delaware has a statute called the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, and it is the most restrictive statute in the nation as far as the adoption of that Bill of Rights is concerned. That statute does not allow for disclosure of police misconduct, complaints, internal affairs investigations, whether adjudicated or substantiated. There's no disclosure permitted whatsoever, no exceptions. Other states specifically allow disclosure of substantiated or adjudicated complaints or permit disclosure with the consent of the officers, but Delaware bans disclosure completely. The subcommittees of the task force, the Law Enforcement Transparency and Accountability Subcommittee and the Community Engagement and Policing Subcommittee, made recommendations to amend the Bill of Rights to increase transparency by increasing access to police misconduct records. And legislation was introduced in June at the end of the last session to repeal the portion of the LEOBOR prohibiting disclosure of such records, but that legislation was not voted on. As we will see tonight, Arizona has a different policy, and we will learn how that affects the legal process of individuals impacted by police interactions and how this transparency affects the relationship between the police and the public in Arizona. Now we would like to hear from our panelists as to how these issues affect them. Each panelist will have the opportunity to speak for up to 5 minutes on these issues. And who would like to go first? Can we have a volunteer? Well, I'm going to call on somebody then. Let's hear from Misty as a public defender.
I feel like Hanif was really wanting to go, but no.
Was he?
So hi everyone, I'm a public defender here in Wilmington, Delaware. And in my view, we are quite affected by the fact that we have the most secretive police law in the country. So just to give listeners a little bit of a perspective, it wasn't always this way, right? Police records were not always secret. In Delaware, particularly back in the 80s, there was kind of a move towards this law enforcement officer Bill of Rights, which was based off of a Maryland statute. And it wasn't immediately okay. There was debate over it. And I've listened to the debates, and the debates were that there were concerns from legislators that if police misconduct was only decided and substantiated by other police officers, it was the fox guarding the henhouse. And even then, police misconduct records, even after the decisions were made internally, were not secret. It took about 10 years later. And in the early 90s, there was a move to then make the police misconduct findings secret in Delaware. Delaware currently is the only state in the country that has a specific law that makes police misconduct records secret. And in the early 90s, as part of the legislative debate, in fact, the Department of Justice actually opposed making these records secret. And the bill was vetoed by the governor, Governor Mike Castle at the time. So it has not always been what some may think as a partisan issue, and it's not always been what some may think as simple as the police and other law enforcement officials are okay with this and others aren't. It was vetoed and it was brought back and it was passed. And so Delaware has made police misconduct records secret for about approximately the past 30 years. And it ain't working. It's not working. And in fact, it's not working on the level where the only other two states that have a law similar to ours, and I'm going to sound like such a lawyer during all of this, were California and New York. And California changed its law in 2018, and New York changed its law in 2020. And Delaware's left. There are other states that do not allow police misconduct records to be public. They're in the minority, and they don't have a special law that does it. Delaware is the only one. And we have to ask ourselves why. And as a public defender, I see it time and time and time again how this stuff matters. There's a Delaware case that allows us to have access to police misconduct records when we've established a predicate. We have to establish basically the fact that we're not just doing a fishing expedition. We show something to say, hey, court, we're not just fishing for this cop's files. There's something here that means we should get it. In my review of the published case law, in 25 years, there have been 5 times, and one was this year, where something like this has been granted. There have also been cases where the police officer is actually the criminal defendant and it's been granted. Several years ago, the prosecutor's office had to file one of these motions to get the police misconduct records of a police officer who was accused of rape. When we really take a step back and we think a police officer has been accused of rape, and the prosecutor's office several years ago had to file a motion with the Delaware Superior Court to get these files, we really have to think to ourselves, what is going on here? And because Delaware is in the minority, because Delaware is one of 50 that has a law as strict as we have, because it really does impact the entire criminal justice system, I have been worried about this issue for a little bit, quite a long time. It impacts everything from start to finish. It impacts bad apples, being on the force and stopping people without reasonable articulable suspicion. It affects officers possibly making up information to arrest people. It affects the process by which we have officers testify to establish probable cause so that cases can keep moving forward in the system. And oftentimes, police officers are the sole or the sometimes most important witnesses in a criminal case. There have been, I think it was a recent report from today or yesterday about exonerations. And there's a previous report about exonerations, meaning people that were innocent, that never did the thing, who have been locked up in prison for a very long time. The main cause, the lead cause based upon the statistics of Innocence Project studies and exoneration studies has been, unfortunately, that police misconduct is the leading cause of having innocent people locked up. And in Delaware, we have had no true reversals of convictions when there are certainly statistically innocent people that are locked up and sitting in prison right now. I have represented innocent people, and our country is founded upon the principles that someone is innocent unless proven guilty. And because we don't know whether officers have been dishonest in the past, as the public, and depending upon how you view it, sometimes in other contexts, how are we ever going to know whether an officer who's been dishonest in the past has been dishonest about this particular client? And it should really, I think, concern all of us who care about innocence, who care about the United States Constitution, and who care about a fair and better criminal justice system.
I think we lost Misty. Not sure if she's finished or not. But okay, well, I'm going to assume that it sounded like she was wrapping up. So let's hear from Hanif.
Wow, Misty was really getting it said in that piece. Good evening. My name is, as mentioned, my name is Hanif Salam, and I am the director of the campaign for Smart Justice for the ACLU of Delaware. And I think that it's just important to understand that since 2005, Delaware police have shot more than 56 people, with officers killing over 30 of them. Nearly half of those that were shot were Black. Police violence is a leading cause of death for young men of color in America, especially Black men. Delawareans who police have shot include Lamont Moses, who was taking a nap in his car, Jeremy McDowell, who was in a wheelchair at the time, Yaheem Harris, who was at 18 years old when police put him in the hospital with several gunshot wounds, and Brandon Roberts, who called 911 for assistance with a mental health crisis. Delaware police officers enjoy more protections from discipline than any other public employee, and our taxes fund these protections. A common denominator among every person who has been the victim of a police shooting in Delaware, no officer was ever convicted of misconduct in any of those cases. And due to Delaware's Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, we don't know if any officer has ever been disciplined for any types of misconduct. As mentioned, Delaware's Leopold statute is the worst in the nation for transparency, making the state a leader in police secrecy. Under current laws in Delaware, the public is not guaranteed any transparency in any police-involved incident. The public has almost no insight on why an accident occurred, what could have been done to prevent it, or what disciplinary actions, if any, happened as a result of the investigation. One component of SB 149, the current legislation to amend Leo Board, is community oversight boards. Community oversight boards are an independent body of people who are not police who review incidents of police misconduct. Leo Board prevents community-led groups such as oversight boards from effectively reviewing, investigating, and disciplining offenders in misconduct cases. At a minimum, we need to amend Leo Board to allow civilian review boards that can review, investigate, and discipline officers in misconduct cases. This is especially important to me being a young Black man living in Delaware. I feel like it's unnecessary and it's unfortunate that I am worried for my life anytime I see those red and blue lights go off. I feel like it's unnecessary and unfortunate that when I see lights, that I have to constantly tell myself that I need to conduct myself in a certain way, although I am not doing anything illegal. And some people may not believe that people just get pulled over for anything, but I've been pulled over for any and everything. From failure to stop completely at a stop sign, for failure to have a turn signal on when I knew my turn signal was on, to I've been pulled over once in the summertime, windows up with air conditioning, and the officer told me he pulled me over because he smelled marijuana coming from my car as I rolled by. And situations like this go on, especially within the city of Wilmington, but across our state. So I just want to be able to have measures where we can hold officers accountable. Not only that, but we could build trust with communities that will make communities safer, right? With these practices, Misty mentioned that came into place in the late 80s and early 90s. We've watched crime across our state increase. And over the past 5 years, increased rapidly. And I think that if we are able to build more trust by creating transparency and accountability within police departments, then communities will be more open to partnering with those departments, and we can keep our communities safer. Thanks.
Thank you, Hanif. Let's hear from Lynn.
Hi, everyone. First of all, let me say that I'm not an expert on the subject matter, but when I dive into something, I do tend to dive deep. I had already left engineering and biotech behind and was focused on social justice and criminal justice issues when George Floyd's murder drew attention to policing. So it seemed natural to start working with my Smart Justice colleagues on Delaware policing. And soon after, I was asked to serve on the Community Policing and Engagement Subcommittee of the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force that was mentioned earlier. This turned out to be a very interesting experience. We were charged with ensuring community-oriented policing policies were consistent with the report on 21st century policing, which had been put out during the Obama administration. And there were several things in that report that are just so pertinent to tonight's discussion. I'm actually going to read just a couple brief quotes from it. There were several pillars in the report. The first two are most pertinent to this evening. Pillar one was building trust and legitimacy. The decades of research and practice support the premise that people are more likely to obey the law when they believe that those who are enforcing it have authority that is perceived as legitimate by those subject to the authority. The public confers legitimacy only on those whom they believe are acting in procedurally just ways. In addition, law enforcement cannot build community trust if it is seen as an occupying force coming in from outside to impose control on the community. There's several other points that are made, including recommendation to adopt procedural justice as the guiding principle for all internal and external policies. establishing a culture of transparency and accountability to build public trust and legitimacy. And specifically, when we get to Pillar 2 on policy and oversight, this report specifically calls for external and independent investigations and prosecutions of officer-involved shootings and other use of force situations. And I found it interesting throughout our work in the subcommittee how often we heard, and I continued to hear over the past year, many of those affiliated with police in Delaware talking about Delaware being so progressive and ahead of the curve. And when it comes to many of the things that are recommended and as best practices in policing this report, Delaware just is not there. We held several listening sessions in Wilmington as part of the work of the subcommittee. And there were a lot of messages that we got, but they all were part of a very consistent theme of a mistrust. You know, there was pervasive mistrust throughout in the groups that we spoke with, at least in Wilmington. And the final point I want to make is that transparency and the need for it to build trust in the community goes far beyond looking at police misconduct and discipline. You know, one of the things that we learned in the work of our subcommittee is that there's transparency is required in all facets of policing, and that includes much of the data, you know, making data, including disaggregated by race and other things that you can look at stops, arrests, and that kind of thing. I know one of the things that was talked about in previous forums were the body-worn cameras and the fact that that was such a big plus in building transparency and trust. But and obviously having the cameras is a very good thing, but it's only good if that information is indeed shared. The policies that will determine whether, when, if and when the recordings from the body-worn cameras are shared is yet to be determined. So, you know, yes, we should pat ourselves on the back for taking the first steps in putting the cameras and the storage in place, but we need to get appropriate policies in place so that that information can be public when appropriate. So with that, I will pass it on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And now for what I'm anticipating is a somewhat different perspective. We'll hear from Larry.
Well, good evening, and thank you for having me. Because I'm an Arizona lawyer, it probably isn't going to surprise anybody that I'm not an expert in Delaware law. And it was a shock to me to learn when asked to participate in this panel that Delaware has a law which, in my view, essentially makes it so that law enforcement officers' personnel records are not public records. And as has previously been talked about, it seems that Delaware is an absolute outlier, where every state that I'm aware of, and certainly every state that I've practiced in, has very liberal public record disclosure laws that include law enforcement officers' personnel files and other materials related to their jobs. And so what I think needs to happen is that Delaware's policymakers and legislature should answer some questions to those who are looking to enact reforms that seem entirely appropriate to get Delaware in line with the rest of the country. And those questions include, why is it that Delaware is so different? What advantage, not only to police officers, but to the public, do the final policymakers and legislatures in Delaware believe come from these secrecy laws? And perhaps also, what harms do these policymakers and legislatures see in other jurisdictions, in other states, that they're hoping to avoid? Because what I can tell you, and I think we'll talk more about this later in the program, is that I come from a state that is fairly conservative. It's pro-law enforcement without question. The law enforcement officers get the benefit of the doubt almost all of the time here. And we have what I believe to be very fair public records laws that allow us to learn all about officers' histories and their job performance. And as far as I can tell, those laws haven't had any detrimental impact to law enforcement officers or law enforcement agencies at all. And so, you know, if it works here in a fairly conservative minded state, why does a state like Delaware need to have a law that is just so different?
Thank you, Larry. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting discussion so far. And as Larry said, we'll get to more questions. But in terms of just sort of a summary of where the four experts are at the uniqueness of the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights in Delaware is a key item. And that any state that has a law that basically no other state has raises a red flag, raises questions. Because in the context of laws, Delaware has lots of uniform laws because uniform laws help from state to state in terms of all sorts of areas of the law. And the states are frequently referred to as laboratories of democracy. And if the state that Delaware copied its law from, Maryland, has changed it, the states most close with the closest law, as Misty said, California and New York have changed theirs. So what's the evidence that supports Delaware maintaining its unique status? And that is, the evidence would show, as Larry just asked the question, is what advantage does the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights provide the citizens of Delaware? What does it do to, and sort of the thesis of the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice is that we need to reimagine policing and bring together communities and the police. Communities and the police should be on the same page in order to be safer. So what does LEOBOR do to bring communities and police together? And that's a key question. And when you ask that question, you have to ask, what is the evidence to support not changing it? Not just an opinion that, oh my gosh, we can't have officers' raw records out there. What's the evidence? Data. People are studying criminal justice. There are just libraries full of books and articles and discussions and seminars all over the country about criminal justice. What is the evidence to support keeping a law that is unique in America? And maybe there is evidence, but I haven't heard anybody looking through the governor's task force's reports, any evidence put forth. It's the notion that secrecy somehow helps the police. Well, if there's an estrangement between the police and the communities they serve, is LEOBOR part of that estrangement? Well, some of the panelists think they are. We should talk about that. Is LEOBOR part of the estrangement between communities? Is it slowing down the process of reimagining? Lynn's example of body cameras is perfect, because body cameras are a thing that they wear. It's not a process, it's not reimagining, but it's a thing. And body cameras for police officers were almost inevitable when everybody in society carries a movie camera with them at all times. So police have their own movie cameras, and just, I haven't seen any solid data on it, but my impression is that police body cameras show mostly police officers acting within the proper parameters. And obviously, they also show officers when they're not acting in proper parameters, but that's good for everybody because that will solve problems and promote trust because everybody can make a mistake and sometimes you have real bad apples. But as Dr. Nolan said, this isn't about bad apples. This is about the process of policing and what its rewards and ramifications are for the officers, which we are suggesting should be more redirected towards rewards for bringing communities and police together and creating safe neighborhoods. So asking these questions about, what is the proof, and then comparing it to other things, because it was pointed out that by Hanif that no public employees except police have the kind of protection police have. Well, does it help that public records are open to find out if there's some problem with procurement, with other governmental functions in policing? There are reasons for secrecy during an investigation while witnesses are still to be interviewed and things like that. So those are the type of exceptions that would be placed in any intelligent bill, because nobody wants to stop a proper police investigation. But by the same token, an investigation can't go on forever. And at some point, it's better for the community, as we see police agencies throughout America rushing out with the body camera footage and producing it for the public. Well, there's a cynicism to that. Well, are the agencies just showing the body camera footage that supports them rather than the agent or the officer, rather than the body camera footage that doesn't? Well, some agencies are very fair-minded about it, and some, quite frankly, don't look like they are very fair-minded about it. But bringing together the communities and the police that serve them is the goal. So looking at evidence-based and getting into, for example, the panelists will now start to elaborate a little bit, but maybe Larry can address the issue of if somebody comes into you and says, I was abused by a police officer, what does it mean to you to be able to get the police officer's employment file and records? What does that do to your analysis? And then maybe Misty can address it from the point of view of a defense. Thanks, everybody. Larry?
Sure. So whenever a new client comes to see me and they say, look, I've had a contact with members of law enforcement that didn't go the way it should have gone. Or if their family members come and see me and say, I lost my son or daughter to an incident involving the use of deadly force by a law enforcement officer, I ask two questions. What happened? And who were the people that were involved? And the purpose for me asking those questions is simple. In evaluating what happened, I'm looking to see whether the officer's use of force was objectively reasonable, which is the standard in the law that governs their conduct from a civil liability perspective. And then the second thing I look to is who was involved, because I want to see if the law enforcement officers in this case may have had a really good record and just made a mistake, or if they're officers who have had a history of problems with their interactions with the police, with the public, or with the department itself. And when I have a case where it might be a close call on whether the use of force was appropriate or reasonable, or whether the police contact, whether the execution of the search warrant was reasonable. When I have a close call and the records that I get tell me that there's a problem officer involved in the contact, that is usually a sign that this is a case that may make sense to pursue in court. But the flip side of that is when I have a close call and the officer's records are good, I may say, look, this may not be a case that's worth pursuing. And so that's one of the things that, that's one of the reasons that I think it's relevant for me to be able to get police officers' backgrounds and their records and their histories when I meet with a new client and determine what I'm going to do next with respect to the client's case or potential case.
Misty, do you want to take a shot at this?
So Tom, I've been having internet issues. Could you repeat the question? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, the question is, what does the lack of transparency, mean in a day-to-day case for you? You mentioned some examples, but how does that elongated offense or somehow impact doing justice? Because we've got the victims need to be considered, the public needs to be considered, cost of the system needs to be considered. So, what does the secrecy do to the entire process, and does it put neighborhoods and communities at odds with the police?
So in Delaware, as I've mentioned, we have the police secrecy law. Currently, civil lawyers that are suing for physical injury, where a police officer has committed some sort of alleged physical injury against a civilian, get these records. So there's certain exceptions, and suing, respectfully, but suing for police officer brutality against a civilian, which results possibly in Delaware in some sort of fix to the police agency, but most often into some sort of cash settlement, you get the stuff. But I have to worry about all the folks that are charged with criminal crimes. And so in these situations, we don't get them. And it's everything, like I explained before, from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. So if if the beginning of the process begins in some sort of poison, that poison can permeate into the rest of the process, right? Not knowing whether a police officer has a record of committing misconduct can permeate the whole thing. And in Delaware, we have some exceptions. I described one earlier, which is the Snowden process, by which the defense has to establish a predicate of some sort of misconduct to get the records. The case law is either that the officer has proven to have been fired or retired, or no one knows why the police officer left. I've also had a recent case where there's been a new exception added. It's a pending case, so I won't get into it. But the other way we get it in Delaware is through Brady disclosures, and lawyers or anyone who's interested in this issue know that under Brady, which is a United States Supreme Court case, if a police officer is on a Brady list by which something has come to the prosecutor's attention where they think that the knowledge of this information could possibly benefit the defense, that has to be turned over. And the prosecutor's office keeps a Brady list of officers, and there's some officers on that, right? And so sometimes they turn over disclosures to that process. But then there's all these other things. And maybe the best way to answer the question is through real examples. So one example would be, there was a case about 2 years ago where a young man was shot by an officer. And it's alleged that that officer then changed the barrel of his firearm after shooting the young man. He also is alleged to have not told the truth about changing the barrel of the firearm. As far as I know, from the only things I know, which are through the media, nobody knew the officer changed the barrel or possibly changed his story about changing the barrel, except for the fact that a whistleblower went to our prosecutor's office and said it. And that is the fundamental flaw of this, right? That as much as we want to say that there's possible exceptions, but for the whistleblower who either went to the prosecutor's office and then that was disclosed to the newspaper around here, we would have had no idea that this officer had allegedly done this stuff. The other examples are officers that have nearly 30 use of force reports that would have never been disclosed, but for the fact that that officer is now criminally indicted. It happens time and time again where it's a catch-22. If you don't know the thing is happening, how is the criminal defense lawyer supposed to argue the thing is happening? And it goes through the whole system, because when police officers testify, I think a jury and a judge want to know whether that person has a history of credibility, a history of appropriate conduct, a history of not abusing their authority, a history of not tampering with evidence. I think that people really do want to know that when they're evaluating the weight of a case. And I think the other thing is, right, like if police officers, for instance, are engaging in misconduct, then we may not be getting the right people in prison. And so the people that I think people are worried about being in prison are still out on the street because the police officers are not necessarily doing the full extent of their job. If they're not telling the truth about one thing, are they telling the truth about another? Another example in Delaware, a real world example, is a police officer was alleged to have been, hired someone to set his own car on fire and have that person spray paint the gang that he was investigating on his car because he was in debt. But for some sort of investigation into him, we would have had no idea about the fact that he had allegedly paid someone to set his own car on fire, spray painted the gang that he was investigating as the chief investigating officer on that car, and on it goes. And so if we want to make sure that our convictions are held up to the highest standard of the law, if we want to make sure that our criminal justice system is fair from start to finish, then I think that the transparency of knowing who has a history of dishonesty, who has a history of excessive force, and who has a history of upholding their authority and upholding the importance and significance of handling evidence is critical to making everyone feel like they're getting a fair shot, everyone feeling like there's a rule of law, and everyone feeling that there's due process. And so I think, and I also think that juries and judges here are concerned about these issues and didn't even know that this is not something that we get through the normal discovery process in Delaware.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Misty. And Lynn, maybe you can address the community. What does it do in the community as you've listened to the panels you've been on the committees you've been on, and talk to people involved as a non-professional in this field? And then we'll get to Dr. Nolan and Hanif, who are professionals next. But what are you hear from the community? Does this cause the lack of transparency cause angst? Does it push people apart from the police? What have you perceived?
I think a lot of people in the community really are not educated about it, don't know what LEOBOR is, don't know that it exists. That in itself is not affecting their day-to-day life. And so I think there are a lot of folks who don't know how this specific piece of legislation will change their life. But what they do know is that it's in the news a lot, that Delaware is an outlier, and that the police are resisting change. And so to me, the process that we're going through is part of what, builds on that distrust, rather than the police being part of the process saying, yeah, we're an outlier, let's update this and change it. We want to be good partners with the community. That would really be saying something. That would be saying, let's get this process going in doing things differently. And so I would really like to see, just a change in the conversation, because I think the conversation itself and what's happening is making news. So people that may not really know the details of LEOBOR and how a change may affect their life still don't like the fact that the police are resisting change, that they understand inherently transparency is good, other places are doing it, we need to do it, and don't like the fact that it's being resisted in Delaware.
Yeah, well, change is Dr. Nolan's thesis of reimagining. So it's a good segue. And it wasn't mentioned earlier, it was in earlier forums, but Dr. Jim Nolan is a Delaware native, and he's spent many years on the Wilmington police force, leaving as a lieutenant to go to the FBI, and now is a professor and a well-known academic in this field. So in terms of the community and police and what the lack of transparency does and will continue to do, you gave some examples before, but do you want to elaborate a little, Jim?
Sure, thank you, Tom. A couple of things that I'm making notes from what some of the others were saying. That again, I'm my position. I come from a place where I think of the policing as a game. The logic of policing is the logic of law enforcement. In that game, what's an honored and privileged position is an aggressive officer who makes lots of arrests. These are outside the department. This may not be highly valued. Inside the department, inside the profession, it is. And therefore, there's the assumption that the best police officers are going to have the worst records in internal affairs, that there are going to be lots of complaints made about them. And so when that does happen, there's these people who are held in high esteem. It's not something that you necessarily want the public to know about. This is why secrecy is also way more important than transparency. And so within the logic of law enforcement, you're not going to convince police officers to support removing Leobor. I mean, this is not even logical, because the belief system is in secrecy and in law enforcement as a way of proceeding. Now, what I've found as a sociologist is something very different. Is that what keeps places safe is what Lynn talked about, is that a belief in the system, a belief in the police officers, procedural justice, and those types of things are what actually keeps communities safe. However, what the police are actually doing by maintaining secrecy and avoiding transparency is creating the conditions for crime. In places where there's lack of trust in the police, there's lack of trust in the system, these places are, this is where all social problems are happening. It's not just because of other sorts of problems like poverty and unemployment and those types of things. Even in poor places, even in places that of mixed race and those sorts of things, where there may be the appearance that crime will happen. In those places where there's tight connections and people believe in the system and they work with the police, these are the places that are the most safe, and by a lot. It's not by a little bit. I mean, these are places, we have numbers that show where there's high levels of trust in the community, even in poor places. The chance of crime is almost, it's negligible. It's almost zero. And the chance that the community members are going to intervene if something happens is very high, like 95%, 96% chance that the communities are going to, if they see something, they're going to do something. And so this is like a body with a strong immune system. So the idea of changing the game, it's not changing the mindset of the police and changing the mindset of former police officers who are now legislators. It's not likely to happen, because the mindset is law enforcement. If you change the game and the end goal is building strong, safe places, then it's logical to get rid of Leobor. It's logical then to be transparent. It's logical to do restorative justice rather than criminal justice. And that's the, that's my experience. I'd like to hear, what Hanif has to say about this too.
Honestly, I could say being on a panel with you guys is really, I don't know. I'm never at a loss for words, so I'm even shocking myself right now. I always speak to a subject matter, and I try to always bring my A game. But for me, this is personal. You know, just last year I was pulled over in Wilmington. Me, and you know, if you don't know me, anybody that knows me, I've been doing reentry work for the past 15 years here in Delaware. I started out turning my life around. I was once incarcerated, but in 2005, I joined Public Allies Delaware. And from 2005 to current, I've done everything I can do to pour back into the same communities that I was once not so positive in. But we talking about just last year, I mean, over 18 years of being home without being incarcerated or anything. I get pulled over riding through the city of Wilmington for expired registration, expired tags, right? And I'm accountable. I knew they was expired. There was some minor repairs I needed to do on the car before taking it through an inspection. So that was my fault for riding with expired tags. But I'm pulled over, cops doing his job okay. I let him know that situation, but he tells me, but you have a criminal background and you're in a high crime area. So do you mind if I search the car? And initially, of course I mind. I'm on my way to my destination. I don't want to have to get out of my car. And it was a long talk about how I'm making it harder than it need to be. And, you know, long story short, I ended up being pulled out of my car, pulled towards the back, towards the police cars, forced to stand there while they searched my car, and in my opinion, be ridiculed and looked as if I'm a suspect in a crime when I'm an upstanding individual, right? I can remember a time a little while back when my daughters were younger and I was taking them down to Middletown to the Family Fun Center. And I'm following the GPS. We're past the St. George's Bridge. I want to make sure I get off on the right exit. Not familiar with Central Delaware or even lower Newcastle County. And I'm constantly looking down at my phone to the GPS, and I'm pulled over by a state trooper. He says, I'm pulling you over because you're on your cell phone, and that's inattentive driving. I want to be sure you're not going to cause any accidents. And let him know, sir, I could appreciate that, you know, but I'm not on my phone. I'm actually using my GPS, just going a couple more miles up the road. I have the children in the car. We're going to the Family Fun Center, sir. Well, they give me license, registration, insurance, comes back to the car. Mr. Salam, I see that you have a drug charge in your past history. Would you mind if I search the car? Are you serious? I have my two daughters and their friend in the car. Long story short, I get out the car. I let him search me. I said, I'm not asking my kids to get out the car. And you cannot search my car with the kids. Well, to make this quick and it won't be hard for anybody, just step out the car, I'll search you. He searched me, but then still had the audacity to shine his little light in my car and look up under the seat from outside the car and told me, go ahead, put that phone away and keep going. You know, and in situations like this, when you talk about is there a lack of trust in the community? Yes, because who am I going to tell? People would say, oh, well, make a complaint to the police. It doesn't work. I know of an officer, I won't say names tonight, but I know an officer in WPD where I personally know of over 20 complaints on this one officer. And everyone who submitted complaint got a letter back saying it was unsubstantiated. We have individuals who have set in a video footage of officers, or this same officer harassing them, right? And it's across the state. It's not just a Wilmington thing. It's the cop. I don't remember his name, but in Dover, he kicked the boy in the face. I don't know if he was disciplined for it. Nobody knows because of Leopold. What I do know, he was able to leave the Dover PD and go across the line to Maryland and get a new job. And unfortunately, once he got that new job, he shot and killed, or he killed Antoine Black. Right? And during Antoine Black trial, it came out that that officer had over 24 allegations, whether it was substantiated, unsubstantiated, I don't know. But it just baffled me, and forgive me for getting a little hype, but why this is so hard in Delaware? Why? If somebody can use my record against me, and I've been clean 18 years, and I make a living off of helping people and fighting for justice, why can't I bring up the fact that this cop has been harassing people since the 90s? What's the big deal? And in closing, I'll say, they got this big thing about why they can't solve crime because nobody's snitching. And if you see something, say something. But what about the police setting the standard and being role models, right? We heard only a whistleblower went and told that cop changed his barrel after shooting Yain Harris. And Jim could probably attest that it takes a brave whistleblower to go to the prosecutor's office, because if you say something within the department, you're going to be ridiculed. So cops don't abide by the see something, say something. It's a blue code, a code of secrecy and privacy. So why is it such a double standard? I don't know. And I wish I could just speak more to my points on it. But tonight, it just kind of got me fired up, because it's like, I see this happen to people every day. It's my first time saying this publicly, but Dwayne Brown, that was a friend of mine. I grew up in that area. And no matter what that cop was going to see him about, why did his ear have to get rocked up against the glass like that? And then look at this process. The cop is on administrative duty. They didn't even say administrative leave. So, okay, I get it. You leaving and getting paid. That's messed up. But administrative duty, you just went from patrol to a desk job. Why are you investigating? And to be honest, people don't even know that only got viral. Dwayne Brown put that footage up. It was on his Facebook for weeks. Luckily for him, a local media person seen it and decided to call him in for an interview. And then it got publicized. And now we're talking about what's going to happen to the cop. But it shouldn't be this hard.
And Hanif, I want to interject something here, because you mentioned in particular the Wilmington officer that had over 20 complaints, and mentioned that most of them were unsubstantiated, supposedly. So we know that disclosure is on a continuum from complaints, logins, actual complaints, complaints in process, complaints that have been substantiated, unsubstantiated complaints. How, to your point, when somebody has 20 complaints logged against them, albeit supposedly unsubstantiated, how relevant is that in terms of the issue of, is something going on here, in the trust between the public and the community?
Good question, Claire. Not only trust between the public and policing, but best practices just say that is how you follow patterns and behaviors. So yes, the police have a set of rules as to how they define unsubstantiated and substantiated cases. But if a person has more than 24 complaints, it appears to be a pattern or behavior there that needs to be looked into. And that will be what will make civilian review boards so necessary and viable, because under our current system, law enforcement doesn't care about the complaints. If they're unsubstantiated, to them, that means it never happened. It could be fake or false. And that is one of the hiccups that people need to understand, that they are trying to amend with SB 149. They're saying, to in a sense, okay, we will give you substantiated and serious. So basically, if a cop kills a person, we'll make that record public after we discipline them or decide what's going to happen to them. But anything less than that, we're not going to tell you about. And it's part of that secrecy that Jim talked about that allows cops to blur the lines and break the rules.
Larry has an answer to a question that popped up in the chat.
Yeah, so Misty brought up a point that might not be clear to people who don't litigate civil rights cases often, and how that litigation intersects with a government's required production of documents or evidence. And that is this: when a lawsuit is filed, as a result of police bad conduct. It's almost always filed under the Civil Rights Act, which is 42 USC section 1983. And it's almost always in a federal court of law. During the litigation, I am almost always going to get all of the materials that I would not be able to get through a public records request because of Leobor. So and the reason is this, because the Civil Rights Act is intended to prevent states from erecting roadblocks to the enforcement of civil rights. And so what happens is courts say if there's a claim against the municipality for what we call municipal liability, one of the things that's relevant is how the municipality disciplines its officers, and whether complaints are made again and again and again, and they're just found to be unsubstantiated again and again and again, that can be evidence of a problem at the police agency. So I am confident that whenever I file a lawsuit, either here or anywhere else in the country, that alleges municipal liability, I will be able to get the officer's personnel records that are not allowed to be disclosed in response to a public records request under Leobor. And here's why this is important. The disclosure of these records in my cases, if I file a lawsuit, is inevitable. The only question now in my mind is, when are these disclosures going to happen? In other words, do I have to file a lawsuit in order to get the records? If the answer is yes, and then I get the records and determine, wow, this probably isn't a righteous claim, this may not be something I want to continue, all that has happened is that the police officer and the police agency has been brought through litigation when it might not otherwise have needed to go through that process. And the only reason we had to go through that process is because I wasn't able to get the records earlier because of a law like Leobor.
So Leobor can beget litigation.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
in fact, quick trigger litigation that might not otherwise have ever been filed.
No question about it. And I suggest that Leobor probably harms officers more than it helps, because there are absolutely bad apples out there. And for the last 10 years, I've been litigating mostly cases against police officers, and as a result of those bad apples. But there are some good officers too. And if I can learn that early on, that means that there's a good chance I might not file a lawsuit against them. And so that's the reason why I believe that these secrecy laws hurt more than help officers, because if the officer did something bad, I'm going to sue them regardless of what Leobor says, and I'll get their records in the federal lawsuit.
And if a lawsuit is filed, these cases, I know from my experience, are tremendously expensive. So it would cost a municipality or its insurance company, which goes to insurance rates, a lot of money just to get through the discovery phase, or to the discovery phase, and then get dismissed.
Yeah, and of course, that's just a waste of taxpayer dollars as well.
Jim, have you seen any trend around the country, or Larry, have you seen any trend around the country of police agencies wanting to reverse the trend? The trend has been to open up records. Is anybody saying let's go back to the old way?
There was one example that I can point to in Maricopa County that related specifically to the timing of the release of body camera evidence, where the former Maricopa County attorney suggested that they should not be released pursuant to a public records request, at least before a personnel investigation had concluded into the officer's conduct. I can tell you, I don't believe that view has been widely adopted, but that's the only thing that's the only measure I've seen recently where a municipality tried to roll back public records rights.
Tom, I haven't seen municipalities try to reverse to become more secret. And I think it's probably the case is that there's fear out there in the police that if labor is removed, that things are going to be horrible. And it just doesn't play out that way, as Larry mentioned. That the bad things just don't happen the way it's talked about within the police circles.
And that gets back to the evidence-based, the notion that everyone who comes to the table seeking a change at the legislature or a change of a rule or anything should bring with them evidence. And people will have feelings, and that's a fine way to start. But what is the evidence that would say, oh, let's not have public procurement. I know who to hire to build the highway best. I know who builds bridges best. I know who to hire best. We don't need public advertising for jobs. Well, I don't think that'll go very far because we've learned in the last 100 years that that's a way to solve problems and make it better for everybody to have a public process. And Leobor is at odds with that really 100-year or so trend, especially since it stands alone.
Can I just add a quick thought here? I'm curious as to what others think in terms of when we say that police in Delaware just don't want to see changes to Leobor. How many of the everyday officers that are out there really even know what Leobor is and what it does? I know there are a lot of voices at the top that are going to the stakeholder meetings, and the leaders of the FOP and the Police Chiefs Council and stuff are saying, yeah, we don't want these changes. What about the everyday police officers? What do they know or think about it? I'm not convinced that they would necessarily feel the same way. Just a question.
Well, Jim was an everyday officer who worked his way up into lieutenant. So Jim, you want to start?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't believe that the rank and file officers who are going into their districts, that they're really very concerned about things like Leobor or any of the other bigger issues related to policing. Because there is a sort of they're conditioned to respond to complaints, to make lockups, to seize drugs and guns. So they're on a mission. But I think that it's easy to bring through police unions and through police leadership to rally the forces against it. And I think that there are, particularly in Delaware, I'm aware of a number of legislators who have strong ties to the police and were former police. So you have a lot of the pro-police perspective within the legislature. So it's difficult to convince this particular group of people that Leobor is not a good idea. But the rank and file officer, I think Lynn's right. I mean, probably it's not a big issue to the person working 22 car or something like that.
You know what, John? That's where my philosophy of bad apples come in, because in my opinion, the bad apples are familiar. We have something by the name here in Delaware, Operation Safe Streets and the Governor's Task Force, who constantly blur lines, violate people's constitutional rights for the sake of getting guns and drugs off the streets. And those officers know that no matter what they do, they will not be held accountable because they are policing the criminals. Those officers know that if they find a certain individual with an amount of cash and no drugs or gun, and they take the cash, that nobody's going to hold them accountable. They know if they use of force but bring this guy in who they are accusing of possessing 2 firearms. Nobody's going to worry about the use of force because they just got 2 more guns off the street. And that's what breeds the misconduct. So to answer like Vicky's question in the chat, yes, it has to be a full culture change. And it has to be like Jim alluded to in his presentation, where departments decide to reward officers for community actions and for being officers of integrity, as opposed to awarding people for discipline. I mean, we got a case when you talk about misconduct. It was recently in the Delaware News Journal that the Delaware State Police honored a young man for having the most tickets and citations in the whole department for a year. Later to find out that this officer was committing fraudulent tickets and citations, often writing people tickets for incidences where they were not pulled over or were not even proven to be driving at the time. So that's a problem when a guy could get a reward, and it's not probably until a whistleblower or someone who was mad, who was actually doing good cop work, saying, hey, you gave this guy an award and he's not even doing the job right. And then now you come back and say, oh, well, we'll handle that. We made a mistake. And you're the only department allowed to function like that. You know what I mean? Even as minute as my job is, if my job says we want this report and send it to Bob, I can't send it to Sally a day late and say, oh, I forgot the date and who you said to send it to, and not be held accountable. But yet, like, I like how you referred it to as a game. That's kind of how they look at it. But these are people's lives. They have the ability to take people's freedom and often take the very breath out of their lungs. And if you don't hold them accountable, those ones who like to blur the lines, they know that they won't be held accountable.
Thank you, Hanif. We've got some questions in the chat, and anyone who wants to write in the few minutes we have left with a question in the chat, please do so. But one of the questions, and this maybe Larry can start with this, is that, you know, how can you get the DOJ civil rights to take a case, or I guess state civil rights as well? If you can address that, because I think we've kind of muddied the water a little bit by bringing in DOJ.
Right, yeah.
But,
and I'm assuming you mean the federal
either
Department.
one, it's federal or state, because have you
Yeah.
seen the state DOJ and the Attorney General's office and the states you practice in, or federal, come in on cases like you handle?
Much more likely, in my case, for it to be the federal DOJ, and there's a Department of Civil Rights that you can contact, and they're actually full of really experienced lawyers who will listen to you. And so there's just a general line, and I don't have it handy, but you can submit a request for an investigation, and they'll get back to you. Yeah. It's really kind of an independent branch of the DOJ that is quite responsive to the public.
And they don't collect damages. They investigate for, to fix things, not damages. But in Delaware, the Division of Civil Rights and Public Trust has just been elevated to division status. And on the state Department of Justice Attorney General website, they have a complaint form that you can fill out for civil rights violations if you wish to do that. And does anyone have experience with how that works? I do not have direct experience in Delaware. Apparently not, but these investigations in terms of patterns and practices can take a long time. And there's been lots of stories recently about the Federal Department of Justice coming in and looking top to bottom over police agencies in big cities. Phoenix is one that got headlines recently, and Larry is home.
Can I just comment on the state level? So at the state level, there is the Delaware Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. They've recently been able to pass a law that's broadened their scope. So before, it was they could only have power to look at cases that involved the use of force that resulted in that were promoted by either a firearm or result in death. And so that was some of the problems that they were facing, was that they were looking at a limited number of cases. The recent law has increased it to include, I believe, serious physical injury as well. If anyone's interested in this issue, I would recommend that you go to their website and look at some of their previous use of force reports, because they do go into the information of several police officer related shootings in Delaware. And so I think that there, is a limit to the scope that they have, but also I think that there is some interesting thoughts that could be had where, especially when we're talking about reimagining policing, of the Delaware Department of Justice looking at these issues and the powers they have to do what they need to do next. So I just wanted to kind of bring up the fact that I think that statutorily their scope is a little bit limited here to what they can actually look at. And also, if people actually take a look at some of the use of force reports, it would be interesting to, I think, civilians about what is looked at, what's reviewed, and also what is put out there publicly.
Also, what's interesting is it was only this year that our use of force statute was amended to make the standard for determining whether the force was justified as a reasonable standard, an objective standard. As an attorney, even though I don't practice in Delaware, I find it incredible that most of the nation has a subjective reasonable standard, and Delaware had a subjective standard. So whatever use of force reports you can access, as I think are colored by that subjective standard, as opposed to hopefully what is now going to be a different reasonableness standard.
Well, maybe we can go back to Jim and then Clara for a wrap up. But on the entire idea of reimagining policing is not just one thing. It's not a camera. It's not even review boards. It's an entire attitude and a broader issue. As Clara was just saying, the pieces are important, like the standard. When the legislature changes a standard, that's good stuff. But in Leobor it seems that everybody here tonight is Leobor is unique, and it becomes an irritant and a roadblock, and actually costs governments money and may hurt the police. So if Delaware is going to move towards reimagining, all of these little pieces have to be sort of knocked down one at a time, but it's all part of a bigger picture of how to get to reimagining.
Within the police circles, policing is perceived as a very dangerous profession. That going into homes and taking custody of people and all these things, the way it's organized to arrest violators of the law, that the police take on a disposition where there's no yielding, and we have to stand our ground and those sorts of things. And we have to prioritize secretiveness versus transparency. This is all part of the logic. But what's interesting to me is that within the police circles, it's also very hard to convince them, officers, that they'd be so much safer if they shifted their focus from arresting people to basically controlling people inside neighborhoods, to helping communities, befriending communities, building relationships, helping to solve problems. The police officers would be much safer in that sort of a situation than in the current one, where they're resisting Leobor and those sorts of things.
Our time is getting a little bit short. We've got just about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I guess what the question I would pose to the panelists is there a single key point we can take away from this discussion?
I'll lead off and say, we've already been acknowledge that changing Leobor itself is not going to be a significant step forward in reimagining policing. However, to me, it has become a significant indicator of the political will in Delaware to make change. This is where everyone is focused, the energy is, and it is something real and significant that is a barrier to making progress. So this is a hurdle we have to get over, but hopefully it is just that first step demonstrating political will to make change so that we really can get to the point of reimagining policing and really get into those interactive discussions with all kinds of folks at the table saying, how can we really do things differently and move in that direction? So that's what I'll leave us with. Thank you.
I would end by saying that public records laws exist in every state at the federal level, and they exist because transparency is important, and the government knows that it's important that governments are transparent so that its citizens can know how its money is spent, who's leading them, whether changes need to be made at the ballot box. And I can't think of an area where transparency is more important, especially today, than in law enforcement. And this is literally at the local level, the only part of the government that can both save and cost lives every day during split-second interactions with the community. And it's hard to imagine a reason why, if transparency is important and Delaware recognizes that it is in other areas, it's hard to understand why there's an exemption for this area, which probably impacts people more directly than almost any other aspect of governance.
I'd like to point out, oh, sorry. I just wanted to point out quickly that there is a stakeholder meeting tomorrow on SB 149, the bill to amend Leobor, which is put on by the bill's sponsors, inviting public commentary on it. I put the link to register for it in the chat, and you can either register to be a speaker or you can submit written commentary.
Trust is a key factor in any working relationship. And at this point, there's not a lot of trust with community across the state and police departments. I think that SB 149 is the first step in rebuilding that trust, making police disciplinary records accessible to the public and allowing for civilian review boards to be effective in having a say in the way that police are recruited, trained, investigated, and disciplined. If we build trust amongst community and police departments, I believe that together we can create safer communities across the state.
And I strongly agree with that, Hanif. And you know, I think that sort of my takeaway from this is that transparency is a necessary first step in reimagining police that brings the police and the community together to be more effective. I mean, we live in I'm in a university that has a huge forensic science program, and I know that there are many forensic scientists being trained, and there's better science now than ever before, but clearance rates are abysmal. The crimes are not solved because there's no relationship between the police and the community. And when I heard Hanif talk about the situation that he's in, I asked myself, if you talk about accountability, who's accountable for creating that situation? Who's accountable for maintaining distrust in the community, for creating the conditions where crimes more likely to occur because of this lack of trust? Who's accountable for this? we talk about transparency and accountability on an individual level, but there's a broader accountability that needs to be brought to bear in this discussion. And I think that's perhaps for another session.
Well, our time is just about up. I would like to thank all of our panelists for a fascinating, provocative discussion. I would like to thank Larry for, giving us Arizona's perspective and taking time out. It's during the day there, still in Arizona, so you're taking time out from your day to join us. Thank you very much. And I would also like to, of course, thank our own Calvin Jackson for doing the production on this. We are stay tuned for word about our next session. Date undetermined yet, but we'll get it out there. And I hope to see all of you again. And again, thank you all so much for your participation tonight.